I've never wanted the rugby match I was watching to be a great game less. Big time deciders in rugby are normally more tense and tight at the expense of flashy and fun. It's intensity over all else as titles swing on the smallest of errors. This year's Six Nations finale, however, went so much further. Saturday's encounter between Wales and France was close enough to containing everything anyone could possibly want or enjoy out of rugby. This was a match nearly as good as the sport can possibly produce, an occasion packed with every kind of spectacle, causing those from all Six Nations and way beyond to experience a wider array of emotions than Peter Steph Toy watching a Pixar marathon. I've experienced God knows how many thousand rugby matches in my life, but this stands as not only the second toughest to take as someone emotionally invested in Wales, but once separated from the heartbreak and eternal feeling that the next Grand Slam might be 30 years away, one of the very best. It's a game with everything, and it had all of it at least twice. The high-scoring, attacking-minded rugby didn't come at the cost of tension and tightness, at drama and defence. We got the adrenaline of a goal line stand, something no other sport can possibly produce. We got touchline conversions. We got Antoine Dupont finishing a 50-metre beauty. We got it all. So what parts did either team play in settling the season? How did Wales put in the best performance of the Pivac era so far, possibly? And what did France do to stop the slam? I don't know about anyone else with Welsh blood, but ever since full time, I've had endless scenarios from the final few minutes running through my head. My brain putting the whale into Wales. Every few seconds stood another turning point, a sliding doors moment that might have kept the proverbial shut for France's final try. And maybe that's the best way to do this, to tell the story of the match through the assorted traumatic trace memories that will be flooding back to everyone in red in the middle of the night for some time yet to come. And I don't know about you lot, but honestly, trust me, this helps, or at least help me try and get over it. It's like therapy, except our privately educated government are more likely to properly fund rugby coverage than mental health support in the NHS. Moment number one, stop millimetres short. France hit up Gelange on a short ball, only for him to fumble forward as North absolutely lines him up. Vakatawa turns to his teammate instead of playing to the whistle, and Sheedy can come away. Liam Williams is way out wide, and he weighs up the pass, taking his time until Penno comes up to Mark Williams, allowing Sheedy to welly it into the space where he should have been stood, instead of looking for touch. This allows Dulin to take the ball on the second bounce and launch a counter-attack. This, not kicking for touch, is typical of how Wales kicked all match. Perhaps the smartest thing about this Welsh campaign has been how they've adapted their kicking strategy game on game, knowing Dan Biggar and Callum Sheedy have broad enough boots to change it up each week. Against England, they kicked infield to prevent them launching off their line-out, as is Eddie Jones' ideal. Against Italy, they kicked for territory, knowing the Garbisi gang become exponentially worse every metre they get closer to their own try line. Against Ireland, they kicked in a very Gatlin manner because they were more comfortable without the ball and with it. And against Scotland, they realised their kicking strategy wasn't working, so brought both halfbacks off at the 45-minute mark to change up the boot-based tactics and in turn change the game completely. But against France, they kicked with a huge element of risk. In Paris, Wales kicked to pressure and manipulate, perhaps the best example coming in the fittingly frantic first play. Wales go backwards 2 phases in a row, so Biggar slots into the pocket and hangs it, essentially aiming for the huge cross on the pitch here. This gives North and Rees-Zammit a really clean target to chase, but also Gooders hits the spot where each French back has to run the furthest to cover it. Teddy Thomas is closest, but taking high ball running backwards is hugely risky, so Dulin has to cover about 30 metres to get under it. This doesn't give him time to adjust the two Welsh chasers, and he knocks it on. This is what Wales are hoping to do, to pull the French backfield out of place to cause errors. However, it can also cause a huge amount of self-damage if not done properly. After the clearance, Sheedy hairs it up and disconnects from the rest of the chase slightly, giving Dulin an opening and leading to both a break and the eventual yellow card defence by Liam Williams. It's a tiny break off from the line, but if your chase isn't perfect when kicking like this, it's a huge problem. And moments after Biggar's pinpoint kick, Gareth Davis tries a chip that isn't as on. Jalibert is dropped into the fullback position and considers the counter-attack before thumping it back after spotting Wales haven't got much cover in behind. Biggar gets there first, but the pressure means Adams has to clear off his wrong foot. This pressure then presents France with an opportunity to attack. And they do that. Over 10 phases, they make it up to 22 before managing to milk the penalty that eventually leads to their first try, a product of an incredibly well-worked move. Over the last few years, Josh Navidi has become one of Wales' real weapons. Whilst he's useful with the ball himself, his major attribute is his amazing ability to cancel out opposition threats. With the likes of Billy Vanapola, David Pocock, Michael Hooper, Tom Curry, Sia Khaleesi, Dwayne Vermeulen, whoever else, basically any other world-class back row you want to name, having amongst the quietest games of their career when opposite Navidi, because he's so good at targeting and silencing other back rowers. And so a chunk of his job on Saturday was to stop Gregory Aldrit in a similar manner to how England employed Charlie... No, don't tell me. Brown? Bucket? No, that's... He played for Quins, didn't he? It begins in a B. Charlie Barkley? Charlie Hot? No, that's a different guy. Charlie. That's how they use Charlie. The only problem is Navidi is so good at cancelling out others. He's kind of developed a reputation for it. And so France worked out a plan to cancel him cancelling anyone else out. Navidi is located at the back of the line-out, so he can easily split off and hit any big ball carriers early. Paul Willemse begins in the middle of the line-out, being a jumping option, but once the ball is in motion, he jogs round to just tug and grapple slightly with Navidi. He just makes sure he's on the outside of him, so Navidi has to run round him, taking an extra split second to get into the defensive line. This failsafe taken care of, France can now focus on opening up the defence as a whole. Damien Penaud, the winger, steps into the line-out. Now, when teams throw backs into the line-out, they tend to be putting them in the middle so it's less obvious, so the opposition aren't on the lookout for something tricky. Except this is the point. France want Wales to notice him, so he stands at the back. Both Adams and North are watching him the whole time, trying to work out what the trick play is going to be. So, as France feign a maul, Penaud and Dupont both wrap around to the blind side. North spots it, points and sprints to help Adams and Owens out. And in doing so, does exactly what France want him to do. Penaud and Dupont were both a distraction to pull North, a far bigger hitter, out of place. The ball goes instead to Aldrit. Normally, he'd have both North and Navidi waiting to smash him, but clever play has stripped away all but the fly half. Dan Biggar makes a really solid contact, but he can't stop him dead. It takes Navidi wriggling past Willemse to slide in and hold him up. However, whilst France's forwards can hop in a straight line to the ruck, the Welsh forwards are scrambling to get into position either side, and it only takes 2 phases for them to drive over. Taufe Whanua here goes for a high-risk, high-reward finish. You're at greater chance of knocking the ball on, but you're also at far greater chance of getting to the line before the opposition. The latter happens, he scores a try. Wales then launch themselves off set piece moments later. Wales' first try last week came from using the referee as a blocker, and they do the same thing this time. Pearce's positioning buys Davis a half second in which Dupont can't get to him, so he holds the ball until Jalibert makes his decision. He has John Davis running a hard line, Dan Biggar wrapping around the back, and Gareth Davis willing to go himself. With Rhys Zammit kind of floating somewhere in the middle of the free, Jalibert drifts to cover Foxy and Biggar. But this combined with the second Dupont is out the game, trapped by the referee, opens this hole, and the quickest player in the competition needs no second invitation. He offloads, Davis is held up, but it gives Wales a scrum 5 to launch again. Now, not wanting to give Davis such a clean run again, Dupont strays offside and gives away a penalty. This does disrupt the pass, however, so Wales call the move off and just let North crash it up. They then play a few phases near the line before this. Tipperic's tiny slip ball is so subtle, France try to tackle both him and Faletau, and it leads to this massive bodies piling into the ruck. Marchand folds to the blind side, sliding further out as more French players get up to their feet, so Biggar makes the most of it, hitting an out to in line in the opposite direction to Marchand's movement and finishing. All of this is a very long-winded and several sidetracky way of saying Wales' kicking strategy, very up and down. Of course, it doesn't matter how smart your kick is if the chase is offside, however. This is immediately after Halaholo has entered the field and he isn't quite settled. If Wales left John Davis on for one more passage to play, maybe he doesn't get away with this penalty and Wales don't get trapped in their own 22 and they don't lose the game. But anyway, we're getting ahead of it. We're getting away from the point. The point is kicking. Back to Wales' kicking. Their kicking in the middle 2/3 of the field was very, very good and forced mistakes, or at least prevented France counter-attacking, but their kicking from their own 22 was poor. Wales looked to keep it in play, again hoping to create errors and panic, but they just gave France opportunities to counter-attack, and that's exactly what this team thrives off. Wales like to send up a complete line instead of a solo Adams or Zammo to compete, so it gives Dulon lots of time to weigh up his options. They shift the ball and make the Welsh wall work, and then with some effective phase play, Jalibert is happy to just stab through a kick, knowing the worst case scenario is Wales cover it and eventually clear, using exactly the same kick they just did, giving Dulon more time to counter. He slows down this time and invites Aldrit to crash it up so that he's free for the following play. Of the previous kick, France tried to work around the Welsh wall, but this time Dulon steps in as first receiver and dinks a kick over. After kicking himself, Gareth Davis is deep in the backfield and it's Faletau filling in at 12. He's physically capable of doing anything a centre could normally do and filling that position, but he wouldn't have trained to turn and cover a kick in the way Wales would like. And so France flood numbers around the kick. Jalibert has Dulon left and Dupont right and times it perfectly, waiting until Davis Jalibert bites in to put Dupont away and over. However, anything France can do, apart from having a scrum half with an IQ higher than number on his back, Wales can do just as well. Their attack looking incredibly composed and balanced, the team finishing on almost every opportunity. Which brings us on to the next trauma. And I apologise because it's going to take a while to link back to my original point, but trust me, this. This is a penalty try yellow card offence by Mohamed Hawass. Yes, Wyn Jones is eventually stopped by two French players who are in an onside position, but it only happens because Hawass rips him out from an offside one. But whilst Wayne Pivac can complain about the referee's decision, Wales are equally at fault for this score not being given. If they let this die at the breakdown here, ground lost, no way they can play on advantage, chances are Pearce goes underneath the sticks and gives 7 points. Instead, the two Wyn Jones' offload and Reece Zammit can make an incredible attempt at scoring in the corner, only just denied by a centimetre, if that. But after seeing Wales take advantage like this and almost finish, you can't really, as the referee, call it back for a penalty try phase earlier. Wales overplayed their hand. Almost every complaint anyone can ever have about a referee in a game of rugby ultimately comes down to something a team has done in failing to play them. Instantly, Luke Page was outstanding. He was just absolutely brilliant on the weekend. Just want to throw that in there. Instead, Wales do have to make do with a penalty. And at the time, and even more so in hindsight, I was shouting to take the scrum, repeating the trick of last week. France have a prop in the bin, and a scrum forced them to take off another player instead, which ended up being Gregory Aldrit. But more importantly, Wales were lethal on attack, breaking France down better than any other team has in the Gaultier-Edwards era. And you felt they would have scored if given time and possession, something we saw across the rest of the match. Whilst Bigg's try was ruthless finishing, the other two showed the variety of ways they're capable of creating a score. Our first phase, Wales ran a series of crash balls, 2 out of 3 featuring a player running a false hard line to attract defenders so the actual carrier can hit a weak shoulder, and then Wales run this. They shift the ball right then back in left, throwing the French defence about. It creates in the end this picture. France heavily loaded on the blind side to mark the Welsh backs, assuming they'd never play to this side. Look, it's a second row, it's 2 of 4 stood super deep and just a winger to hold their width. It's stupid. No one would ever be dumb enough to play that way, but also it's a trap. We saw some glimpses of it in the last Six Nations, but Wayne Pivac and Stephen Jones are doing something really exciting with the Welsh attack. For the last 7 years or so, rugby team structures have been dominated by variants on the 1-3-3-1 shape, which just dictates how a team lays out their forwards across the width of the pitch. 1 forward alone, stood on either wing, 2 groups of 3 in the middle, meaning a standard shape looks something like this, then the backs filter in around as separate entities to distribute from one pod to the next. The last 3 years, we've started to see more variants on it, changing how many forwards stand where. Ireland and Australia have adopted the 1-3-2-2 system, the Springboks toyed with a 2-2-2-2, and the Crusaders in Super Rugby play a 2-4-2, the most intricate of all. But Wales attacked their attack from a completely different angle, involving not the shape of their forwards, but their backs. At points across the Six Nations, we've seen a Welsh back from every position, even scrum half, fill in as a piece of the 1-3-2-2 forward shape, allowing the pack to filter into the positions normally occupied by backs. Essentially, they're looking to make the forwards and backs entirely interchangeable. We've seen Tipperick and Faletau slot in as distributors, and John Davis as a front row forward. It not only changes up the threat for a defender, but allows Wales to set sooner, as they're not reliant on the same 8 players slotting into shape. The strengths of this are evident in almost every try they've scored this championship, but there are weaknesses too. After Wales hired Reece Zammit to give him a great first phase carry, they start using the likes of Davis and Adams in forward pods, altering the shape, but whereas stricter shapes would force Tipperick to commit here, instead he assumes the ball is safe and drifts out into the back line, only for Paul Willemse to come away with the ball. This is the risk you're running, right? You're hoping the pace and dynamism will counteract the slightly less safe ball. Their attack is still a work in progress, but it's come far enough that it can craft a try from this, the kind of pitch that rugby fans see and assume is going to be a major loss in ground and momentum. Pivac's Wales are trying to remove the distinction between forwards and backs, but the opposition aren't so free thinking. So Vakatawa and Penno see this as 2 smash-bass forward lumpheads well behind the gain line and fly up to batter them. The kick isn't even a consideration, it wouldn't go through their heads until after Tipperick's already made it. Penno has oversold himself trying to mark the space, and instead it goes into the area he'd normally be covering. Adams as such beats him to the ball and puts a lovely touch in field to Williams to regather, who then offloads the man himself to finish and score. I honestly think we may be looking at this kind of thing as a bit of a watershed moment in years to come. What Wales are doing, trying to remove the distinction between forwards and backs, has long since been an inevitability, and we'll see more and more teams doing it as players with the skill set of Tipperick or Faletau start to pop up. The way the game's going, in 4 or 5 years, I fully anticipate all back row forwards will be expected to be able to kick. Young players such as Hoskins Tutu and Alfie Barbary show this is already happening. The game doesn't need new laws like the 50-22. The sport is already evolving new ways to attack, attack, and soon enough a forward in the wide channels will mean it's risky to leave your backfield undefended, even without laws incentivising more kicking. However, sometimes good old-fashioned keeping the ball in hand is exactly what you do need, and that's just what Wales do for the second try. They pin the ball into the corner to give Dupont as tricky a clearance as possible, and Faletau gets a touch to it, allowing Williams to thunder into the line, and from there, Wales just go. There's almost dead on 2 minutes between Wales receiving the ball and Navidi crossing the try line, and in that time, Wales played 22 phases. In order to maintain this pace, Wales strip away all complexity. Across those 22 phases, Wales throw just 22 passes. Davis just flipping the ball to the next runner as they work from touchline to touchline. 22 phases over 2 minutes makes it an average of about 5 seconds between each French tackle, with every ruck taking less than 3.5 seconds. This means the ball is in general play for about 1 to 2 seconds each time. Once you've done that a few times, it makes the line speed that typifies a Shaun Edwards defence both tricky and kind of pointless. Eventually, that leads to this. France have almost given up on the blitz, and Dan Biggar is able to charge before offloading to Davis to make an extra 5 metres. Because Wales are rarely playing far away from the ruck, their shape is simple to set, and exceptions are moments like this, Navidi hitting a hole between French forwards, and to maintain the pace, Wales are unafraid to throw Biggar into the ruck. Forwards and backs interchangeable as Adams pops up in the pod, feigning a tip-on-a-rick ball before exploding past the tackler's weak shoulder. Rees-Zammit carried on the other wing just 12 seconds earlier, but has worked right round to maintain the width, Wales hitting him and warning France no inch of the field will remain unattacked. They're limiting the passes, but they're not limiting the rugby they can play. There's more than a whiff of Eddie Jones about this attack. In fact, it's a near replica of how his Japan team played in many ways, using fast phase play to undo a defence instead of tricksy passing. This is the longest sequence of passes in the move. Williams letting Faletau bowl over Thomas and smashing forward towards the line. And from there, Wales are happy to slow it down a tad as they look to make the last inch by targeting the same defenders left and right over and over until Navidi can cross the line for his first try for Wales, and as well worked a 5-pointer as you'll ever see. At full time, I was worried Wales might have blown their best chance they'll ever get for silverware in the Pivac era, but watching the variety of the attack back, I can't help but be optimistic. Last year we saw the foundations of Jones' super innovative attack, and this year I get the feeling it's the 4 walls and the ceiling. You can see what it is, but they're still yet to add the finishing touches that will really make it home. As such, you had to feel Wales would score if they took the scrum, but even if they didn't, they eat at the clock and manage momentum. It's exactly what France did down the other end, relying on Welsh desperation, knowing any defence will crack in terms of either tries or discipline or both when put under the pressure and strain of 20 straight minutes of brutality. From Rees-Zammit's disallowed try onwards, this game wasn't about Wales playing France so much as Wales playing the clock, and they very almost won. Dream Haunter number 5. The latch. Wales made the decision to eat at the final minute by playing simple crash-up rugby rather than kicking long and allowing France to counterattack. It's a risk worth taking, but they then go for a second that isn't. Corey Hill seals off possession. I've seen some Welsh fans question this, but it's 100% illegal. It's definitely sealing off. It's a correct call, but across most of the game, you're likely to get away with this. Referees only start looking for it when sides slow down the game like this in the final few minutes, because there's nothing else to watch out for. As such, your form when clearing out has to be cleaner than ever, and Hill's slip-up gives France a final opportunity. The French attack is far less structured than Wales's, but built on a similar principle of giving Dupont and Jalibert/Untermatt as many options as possible. Over this championship, they've relied heavily on Dupont to organise the nitty-gritty, Jalibert preferring to wait until the defence is broken down to dance, but the moment Untermatt enters, they start breaking down the defence so much more effectively. The bequeathed wunderkind helping France vary the point of focus way more than they have across the rest of the championship, leading to Gautier's side playing the best phase play attacking rugby they have all year. Here, Dupont selects a runner twice before Untermatt swings round with men flooding off him. He targets Jonathan Davis to create a nice little dogleg and never once looks at Jalanche before flicking the ball inside to send him into a gap. Untermatt is always moving and shaking, always altering the picture for the Welsh defence, shifting a team who've been playing primarily off 9 this championship to a far more balanced, varied team, and also popping up to throw incredible offloads like this for Olivon on the disallowed try. Wales are essentially left scrambling for 20 straight minutes. There isn't the composure we saw in defence under Gatland, but they still can soak up a hell of a lot of pressure. There were some really notable exceptions, but Wales were occasionally quite smart about which penalties they chose to give away. Dropping this scrum is clever. It eats up a very nice 69 seconds off the clock and is so soon after the second yellow that it's a safe bet Pearce will only give a warning before putting them down to 12. But Wales did ride their much discussed luck a little too hard. Almost 20% of the penalties they conceded over the full championship came in the last 20 minutes in Paris, when a team makes not only the assorted cold sweat errors I've already mentioned, but gives away 9 penalties in their own half in pretty quick succession. It's hard to argue that they don't deserve to have lost the game, especially with France so willing and able to take their chances. This carry from the aforementioned scrum by Aldrit causes chaos. I think Navidi is quite smartly trying to roll him back over the Welsh line so he gets held up and given as another scrum, eating a minute or so off the clock, but Penno stops him. Shat pins Tipperick in before he can disrupt anything. With the back row in the ruck, scrum half Thomas Williams comes in as the guard. However, when setting his position, he accidentally puts a hand on a French boot, so waves his arm to move it away, but Olivon notices this and sees it as his chance to drive. With him repositioning, he won't be able to get off the line to stop the French captain, only try to match the bigger man as he crosses the line. Really smart play by Olivon, who had a fantastic game, and it gives France enough time to play for their 4th try, Wales still down to 13. Whereas Jalabert mostly only attacks when he can do something flash, Untermach's decision making in the final passage is hugely important. He calls almost every single ball to himself, the complete inverse of how France have played most of the tournament, and it stretches and pulls Wales, who have to thin their defence massively. The difference between 14 versus 13 men in rugby is far starker than 15 versus 14, and they force each already knackered Welsh player to work so much harder. They're playing inside their own 22, but Untermach brings so much composure it feels low risk. He works left and right and uses these switches and inside balls to make sure the ball never gets too close to the touchline. Untermach just keeps his options open, and as he takes this ball here, he has several passes and several kicks on, but opts to run himself to keep the risk as low as humanly possible. This eventually leads to the penalty against Corey Hill that we've talked about already, and allows France one last throw of the dice, and with it, they do as Wales did for the Navidi try and just play fast. Wales almost hold Untermach up here, but Jelonch enters to tackle his own man, knocking Untermach to his knees, meaning Wales have to release and saving, frankly, the entire game, possibly the entire title for France. The French throw it wide immediately, Dulon stepping in at 10 whilst Untermach is getting back up to his feet, but the moment he is back up to his feet, he takes over again. With his team so close to the line and Wales 2 men short, he shouts and screams at his pack. He calls all forwards into this gap in the middle of the field and all the backs to get right out wide, right out on the touchline. He can see it. They only need one more phase to open this defence up. Wales are expecting a couple of phases, but after a fast first crash, Untermach calls it to himself once again. So torn by playing side to side 2 men down, Wales have run out of whip, and this pod holds Tipperick just long enough to exploit it. Then the work of the backs is beautiful. Untermach has to just ship it on, but both Fickou and Vincent realise their lines are wrong. The temptation of many centres would be to throw the ball wide to Dulon straight away, but if so, the chances are 50-50 on Williams and North smashing him into touch. Instead, what Fickou does is incredible, it's brilliant. He slows down and drifts back inside, straightening the line so North can't afford to drift himself. This, in turn, means Williams has to stop and watch Vincent, meaning the 13 can free Dulon to score in the corner. France are a team powered by batshit, but having the country's 3 most sensible backs in sequence is what makes this score. It's also a great sign of what France can be. There was something frequently ramshackle and too open about Les Bleus this tournament, but in Untermach, Vincent and Fickou, combined with the hard, graft back row of Aldrit, Jelonch and Olivon, they have a core of common sense to get them through the moments where someone does something silly or Dupont's improvisations aren't enough. I increasingly feel France have no interest in building an all-round strategic game, but they do have players with enough rugby intelligence to do that part of the coach's job for him, so he can be left to do the important business, like defending eye gouges or catching COVID. Because COVID has given us a bizarre but very welcome end to this Six Nations. The postponed game not only gives us a weird ending to Super Saturday, with the title still undecided, but also likely changes the outcome. If France knew, say, they had to beat Wales by 3 scores, did they play this final quarter differently? If they knew there was no way they could win the title, did they kick the point to get back within 7, not desperate for the bonus point? Wafflegate gave us a really unique end to the season, but I think those of us who are rugby fans before Wales fans would say we wouldn't swap it for the world. This was a Six Nations that was played in front of no fans, and yet it finished in a manner that will remain in the minds of all of us for decades at least. This thriller on Saturday was the kind of game that will get shown in montages before kickoffs for 50 years. That's not even an exaggeration. That will be wrapped up as a classic match to be revisited before every encounter between these two teams. Look, and it'll probably take 50 years for many of my fellow Welshies to get over the trauma in the corner, but well before that, all of us will have overcome the feeling that we wanted this to be anything other than a really, really great game. You are now up to date on my therapy session, so I hope you enjoyed that. I recognise I missed Scotland Ireland last week. That was entirely a time thing because these videos take a lot of time. And I'm frankly kind of knackered, so I'm not quite sure what order I'm going to do the 3 games that have been played that I haven't got to yet in the next order, as well as Scotland, France on Friday. I'm going to get for as much as I possibly can. But in the meantime, that is the one that most people are talking about, most people are getting on with, covered. So I hope you enjoyed that. There's plenty more floating around the channel. Thanks everyone to support the channel on Patreon. It's hugely appreciated. And I'm also, in keeping with everyone else, going to do a video on, following the end of the Six Nations, my Lions 15 next week. So that's coming then. I'll see you all very soon. In the meantime, have a lovely